Welcome back to But This Time It's Different, the show where we unpack economic absurdity, geopolitical performing art, and the quiet collapse of things that were supposed to be resilient. I'm Sinead, space and defense economist, investor, and someone who spent way too many years of my life thinking about lithium battery patents instead of sleeping.
And I'm Alex, a technology and finance writer, and someone who's realized that BYD might be winning the future while accidentally bankrupting itself.
So today's episode is about electric vehicles, but not the kind that Elon tweets about, of course. We are talking about China's EV empire, how state-subsidized overproduction turned the global car market into a zero-margin demolition derby, and why you might soon be driving a vehicle that costs less than your iPhone, which are becoming absurdly expensive, while recording and reporting more of your data straight back to Beijing.
And of course, it's not just a car story, it's a story about industrial escalation, geoeconomic warfare. Well, essentially what happens when one country decides to speedrun the entire 21st century vehicle industry and forgets to install a brake system.
So we want to trace how China leapfrogged the combustion engine and built the entire tech stack in-house, triggered a suicidal price war, and somehow still came out ahead. Well, that is until, the whole thing collapses under its own kind of lithium-coated ambition, which might happen sometime in the future.
Yeah, so let's kind of rewind back to a simpler time when Teslas were very expensive vehicles for tech bros with carbon guilt, and China's car industry was basically sort of irrelevant. I would genuinely struggle to name a car made in China before about 2009, which coincidentally is when China launched its new energy vehicle program. Arguably, China didn't even bother trying to win the old petrol-driven car vehicle game. It just skipped it.
So while Western firms were kind of still adding spoilers to diesel hatchbacks, Beijing was out there deploying industrial policy like nobody's business. And when I say industrial policy, I mean they were taking this shit seriously. $29 billion in state subsidies between 2009 and 2022, and instant tax breaks for anyone who basically touched a battery. Local government quotas were kind of forcing automakers to churn out EVs, whether anyone wanted them or not. And I mean, back in 2009, nobody wanted them. And then let's not forget their charging network. They built faster than most countries can build a roundabout, or I suppose for our American listeners, turning circles. So it was the Inflation Reduction Act, but with way fewer lobbyists because, China, and way more concrete.
I mean, I'm offended by the suggestion that Europe and the US don't take industrial strategy seriously. I mean, I've fond memories of Europe's attempt to build semiconductor sovereignty using 3 billion euros. But anyhow, just sort of sheer cash contribution aside, I think, as you alluded to, Sinead, China took a much more ambitious approach. It didn't just sort of dole out money to a few people making cars. It had this strategic ambition of owning the entire stack. So it built this sort of supply chain and infrastructure and accompanying geopolitical leverage from scratch.
Yeah, and if we start with the batteries, which CATL and BYD, they now supply something like 50% of global EV batteries. That is half the world. And instead of copying Tesla, they just kind of outmaneuvered them. So LFP, the lithium iron phosphate, became the house chemistry of choice in China. And it's cheaper, more stable. It doesn't explode when you park near a space heater, which I guess is somewhat useful. Yeah, sure. Okay, the negatives is that there is lower energy density. But let's not forget, China is a country where half of your commute is bumper to bumper gridlock. So you don't need range. You actually just need reliability and, the option to not die in a thermal event.
Yeah, moving on from batteries, you also have motors and powertrains. BYD, which is obviously one of the big Chinese EV companies, makes its own in-house electric drivetrains using silicon carbide inverters. They're light, efficient, and about 3 years ahead of anything I've ever seen come out of Detroit. And some of these models are hitting now about 95% drivetrain efficiency, which is just insane.
Plus the software. So because this is where China just flat out skipped the learning phase. While Western brands were honestly struggling to make touchscreen dashboards that didn't lag, like a Windows update, Chinese EVs were rolling out with gesture controls and AI co-pilots and native voice assistants that actually work. And for the record, the least favorite thing about driving a new car for me today is absolutely the bloody touchscreen.
Yeah, honestly, it's amazing what you can achieve when you have no rules on privacy or user data collection, which is definitely something that, Europe can learn from. But if you look at something like Xpeng's like City NGP, it's basically the robotaxi that Elon Musk has been promising and not delivering every time that Tesla's share price has dipped slightly. But it's sort of stuff full of LiDAR arrays, HD maps, a proprietary operating system, and it's already live in cities like Shenzhen. So it's not the kind of coming soon tech that we've historically been promised in the US, although to be fair to the US, like we have seen a kind of real shift there in the last couple of years.
Yeah, but not only have they built this, they've done it at warp speed. So BYD's gigafactories can now roll out a finished EV every 60 seconds. And they make their own chips, semiconductors, even their own cathodes, because relying on Taiwan or Intel is for amateurs.
Yeah, and beyond that, considering that China controls something like 80% of global lithium, cobalt, and graphite processing, if you're ever driving a Ford EV anywhere in Europe or the US, the chances are your battery went through 3 Chinese ports, 2 state-owned refiners, and the form was probably signed off by a customs officer with a CCP patch.
Which brings us to the punchline. You can now buy a fully functioning road legal EV in China for under $5,000. The Wuling Mini EV actually outsold Tesla in 2021. And okay, so it has zero prestige. You really need to Google this thing and just look at it. But it has a top speed of mild panic and, styling. Again, you need to look at it. It can only be described as a kind of sanitized washing machine. You're not going to be robbing a bank with this bad boy, but it is cheap. It works. And more importantly, for people like Elon Musk who care about Tesla share prices, it is everywhere.
So China now makes well over 60% of the world's EVs. So they've gone from being sort of dominant in the market to essentially being the market, and they are exporting relentlessly.
So I want you to zoom out for a minute, because by 2023, the domestic EV market was saturated. So what did China start to do when it couldn't sell more cars on its own home territory? Of course, it started exporting. A lot. BYD exported 250,000 EVs in 2023, which is up 5 times from just 2 years prior to that. And Chery, SAIC, and NIO are flooding Latin America, Southeast Asia, and parts of Europe. BYD now sells cars in Germany, France, the UK, Brazil, Thailand, Australia.
Oh, just on that, as I've mentioned to many of my friends, I wasn't, and have said endlessly, I was in Jordan recently. Basically,
wait, were you in Jordan recently?
Pretty much every other taxi I was in, because Amman is not very walkable, was a Chinese EV of some kind. And because the drivers didn't really give a shit. Interactive dashboard was always still in Chinese. The time it showed was like Beijing time because no one could be asked to change it. And it was just like, no, this shit is really here.
Like, are they good? What did you think?
I mean, they were pretty quiet. I didn't die, but I was less worried about the EVs and more the like appalling
driving
sort of inshallah mindset to driving that was clearly on display, and why drivers seem to remove seatbelts from them for like no reason.
Probably with you on that one, but yeah, I mean these cars are not just shitty knockoffs of better cars. The BYD Seal goes 0 to 60 in 3.8 seconds. I mean, I feel like we should do a Top Gear spin-off here. And the Atto 3 is a top seller in Europe with leather trim and 400-kilometer range for under 40,000 euros. But then with the whole China story, things got weird, because once you've built this kind of hyper-competitive EV ecosystem with over 300 domestic brands, that is 300, you did hear that correctly, and vertically integrated factories and honestly more battery capacity than you know what to do with, what do you do next?
Well, the sort of logical move in a very crowded market, which involves like pretty high capex, is to start an insane price war. And like last year, Chinese EV makers started just slashing prices at an insane rate. So entry-level models dropped under $10,000, like the BYD Seagull. Chery launched a compact EV for $1,000. Wuling then dropped another for $5,000. And this wasn't just a kind of bloodbath among Chinese EV manufacturers. It started hitting the traditional incumbent in this market, Tesla, quite hard. In the space of 12 months, they had to cut prices in China on the Model 3 and the Model Y 6 times just to stay relevant. Which, to be clear, this is Tesla. This is the company that once had luxury brand pricing power, and that's just gone.
Yeah, in the first half of 2024 alone, there were over 40 official price cuts across the top 20 EV manufacturers. And unofficially, I mean, God, there were probably way more than that. Some automakers were offering rebates, free charging. Of course, our favorite, the zero interest loans, buyback guarantees, just to shift inventory because no one was buying.
And so the Communist Party of China, having unleashed a dose of capitalism to kind of build this ecosystem, was horrified by the monster it created and had to kind of row back in a panic. So they started calling the big players into these closed door meetings and issued guidelines to restore fair competition, sort of adopting a little bit of Brussels jargon there, which essentially translated to please stop immolating each other before we've taken over the world.
BYD's stock dropped 17% between January and August. This is the impact of this. NIO and XPeng are burning through cash faster than they can actually raise more of. Profit margins across the sector are averaging, oh my God, this is so sad to even say it, 1.2 and 2.8%, which honestly is barely enough to pay your executive assistant, let alone develop this kind of next-gen world-class autonomous vehicle system.
Honestly, you should become a defense prime or an airline operator with margins like that. But if we were to defend the rationality of this approach for a moment, I'm sure China boosters would say that for the moment, this isn't really about profit. It's about positioning and narrative dominance. And if China succeeds in flooding the world with EVs, which is going pretty fucking well for them at the moment, and it can saturate markets before Europe and the US can even get their supply chains together, it can start setting what the global standards look like.
And that's when this stops being about economics and starts being about something infinitely more interesting, geopolitics. As everybody knows, there's this thing at the minute called the tariff war, and part of that was the US raising tariffs on Chinese EVs to 100%. Not because anyone thought BYD was going to outcompete Tesla in California, of course, but for another really interesting reason, which is that the vehicles themselves are now considered national security risks. And these are quite literally rolling computers. They're filled with GPS, cameras, microphones, motion sensors, driver behavior trackers, chips, hundreds of millions of lines of code. And I went to France last year for a friend's wedding, and the rental car company gave me a BYD. So firstly, I'm probably less worried about the driving in France than you were in Amman, Alex. But the car was amazing to drive, and it was absolutely massive. I'm not a great driver, so this was a challenge for me. It was extremely luxurious, but pretty much the whole time I was in the car, I had my phone turned off because I was so damn worried about accidentally connecting to the in-car Bluetooth system and all of the information on my phone being exported straight to Beijing. When the firmware comes from Shenzhen, the US rightly doesn't see a car in the same way that I don't see a car. I see Huawei on wheels.
So amid all of this, the EU launched an official anti-subsidy probe back in September 2023, targeting BYD, SAIC, and NIO, because the EU has this basic anti-subsidy regulation which allows them to impose tariffs on companies if they believe foreign state support is distorting competition within single market. And yes, you'll be shocked to hear that even Brussels was able to detect the hand of Chinese industrial policy at work here. And they suspected that Chinese EVs being 20 to 30% cheaper than their European equivalents wasn't purely the product of really good design or efficient manufacturing techniques. So tariffs came.
And China hit back with rare earth export restrictions, tightened gallium and germanium supply, which, okay, maybe this is not like an everyday thing like bread and butter, but this actually really messed up Europe's ability to build the most important things that it needed, including, crucially, at this moment in time, the armory that Europe needed for Ukrainian war. In fact, they also hinted at banning Tesla's FSD software from Chinese roads. A neat bit of retaliatory symmetry there. But EVs really are kind of like the new semiconductors. They're hardware, software, surveillance, strategic influence, all kind of rolled into one shiny chassis.
And it's sort of interesting to see how this dynamic is impacting individual automakers. So it's been carnage in Europe, especially in Germany. And Germany's been on this slightly odd journey because, one, for ages, the country was slightly unhealthily obsessed with like exports and its balance of trade in a way that was always faintly incomprehensible to outsiders. China was historically quite a big market for the companies. They not only did they locate a lot of their production there, they sold loads of cars there. And in 2 years, Volkswagen saw its market share drop off a cliff by 30%. Renault and Stellantis developed really, really aggressive lobbying arms. I mean, Stellantis' like previous UK chief executive was like particularly aggressive in like berating the UK government and trying to give them more subsidies. And they're now lobbying Brussels to try and slow down this import wave while also trying to strike these JV deals with Chinese battery firms. So yeah, it's a delicate balance, keeping the market alive and not pissing off the people you are essentially somewhat reliant on.
Well, while these companies are trying to bite the hand that simultaneously feeds them, here's the kicker. China built the most advanced EV ecosystem on the planet. It's vertically integrated, resource rich, scale optimized, but it still might implode. And not because it didn't work, but maybe because it actually worked too well. And now no one can steer this crazy global auto manufacturing machine without crashing it into a wall. I mean, the domestic market, the one that this whole machine was built for in China, is stalling. Growth is slowing dramatically, and EV penetration in urban centers is already really saturated. I mean, if you don't have a $5,000 EV by now, you're probably not going to get one. And in the first quarter of 2024, EV sales in China grew just 13% year on year, compared to 96% in 2021. I mean, this is not just a slowdown, it's actual structural decay and deceleration. And what happens when you mix that with the 300 plus EV brands? I mean, again, this number is so outstanding. 300 brands. I mean, it's simple. You get overproduction, which leads to price compression. And this death spiral that we're now watching of diminishing returns. I mean, this is not competition anymore. This is a liquidation market.
And this problem runs even deeper because you have volume on the one hand, which you've just touched on, but it's also differentiation. When you're buying an EV for less than $10,000, like, as you say, looks a bit like a zhuzhed up washing machine, you aren't buying into, a great heritage product. There's no emotional component or brand moat. It's being completely commoditized, which means that customer stickiness has been eroded completely, and people are purely picking based on price. So if one company cuts its price, everyone else has to follow. Sinead, you'll know this from working with Michael Porter, whose 5 Forces framework invented the whole create margins from differentiating your product thing. Competing on price does nothing but lead to disaster. Again, a bit like commercial airliners, which I mentioned early. So BYD is like clinging to profitability, barely. Net margin sits 3% on a good day, which in manufacturing terms is running on fumes. Some of these other companies are doing even worse, with 400, 500, $800 million losses in single quarters alone. No one's hitting the brakes.
Well, firstly, can I just say that we should do at least one episode on an industry that does not suck? Because, I mean, the only thing that we seem to talk about are the industries that are barely existing on margins that, are on life support. But look, these companies weren't built for restraint. They were built on cheap capital, state support, and honestly, a national industrial policy that doesn't reward short-term prudence. It rewards this very long-term strategic positioning. As we know, this is China. Factories have been built and supply contracts locked in for the long term. These gigafactories are humming 24/7. I mean, there's no off button on this kind of global industry that they've created. So even when demand flattens, as we've already said, Alex, supply does not just turn off, which means they have to do something with all that output. And we talked about exporting, but there's a problem back in China, regardless of how many vehicles you export. Beijing has started nudging, and I say nudging in a very CCP kind of way, i.e. mandating weak EV firms towards this kind of forced merger and strategic exit scenarios. And they're calling it capacity rationalization. But honestly, what this really means is, oh shit, we built too much. Now please clean up quietly before global markets start asking any questions.
Yeah, I mean, this is a classic case of malinvestment where overbuilding happens not because of market demand, but because of misaligned incentives, access to free money, which is a sort of a version of the Evergrande playbook. For people who don't remember, China had this slightly insane sort of housing boom, which was sort of a product of historically Chinese consumers not liking banks very much. So instead, sort of parking their money in property speculation, which is sort of ended about as well as you'd expect, with like a lot of people losing money, Evergrande tanking. And there are these whole sort of ghost cities, so housing and apartments built with this kind of speculative money that just have never been inhabited. I'll try and find it and link to it afterwards, but there is this website that just documents all of these.
When you say like entire cities, but it's been purpose built and completely empty. So we have this unfortunate situation where the global EV market is a bit like a ghost city that should be demolished at some stage in the future. But what actually happens next? I mean, can the West really compete with any of this? Or are we about to get carpet bombed with $9,000 Chinese EVs? The same way that we got flattened by solar panels and steel and suspiciously cheap Android phones, because China's not exactly innovating here. I mean, this is the classic Beijing playbook. Flood the world with your product and kill your competitors with kindness and 70% discounts, and basically win the future by turning it into a clearance sale.
Yeah, and I'd say the US response so far has been a split between half-hearted and optimistic. There's the sort of let's give Elon more tax breaks and hope for the best approach. There was the Inflation Reduction Act, which gave people credits towards the purchase of electric vehicles. And you'll be shocked to hear this, Sinead. Electric vehicle prices rose by roughly the size of the free money the government gave people. Yeah,
I'm shocked, Alex.
Shocked to hear that markets have figured that trick out. A few battery mandates. I think the US has fewer charging stations than Shanghai alone. Tesla's not exactly been doing brilliantly recently. You've had the public meltdowns, regulatory investigations around full self-driving, recalls, less said about the Cybertruck. Probably the better. And then you look at the kind of traditional incumbents like Ford and GM. They are trying, but they're still treating EVs as essentially a kind of weird side quest, and you don't get a sense from the design point of view that their hearts are really in it.
Well, Alex, if you think that's bad, I have another story for you about Europe. I mean, Europe is quite literally approaching this like a philosophy degree in a house fire. And Europe is Europing. It is doing the only thing it knows how to do, which is, unsurprisingly, writing lots of white papers, lots of frameworks, lots of talk about ethical batteries and digital sovereignty, while the BYD Atto 3 casually overtakes your Peugeot on the Autobahn with a €10,000 discount.
I think something that the European bureaucrats in Brussels, with their elevated view of the world, sometimes struggle to understand is that most people don't actually care if their EV or frankly any other piece of technology has European values, especially if they're being forced to buy them. So while Brussels is still doing its fifth position paper on sustainable procurement, like, people are buying what China has to sell.
Yeah. And what is China betting on? I mean, it's not just the overcapacity. It is actually betting on the collective economic trauma of the past 15 years. Okay. What is that? Well, let me tell you, it is stagnant wages, housing crisis, and a cost of living squeeze so intense that we're nostalgic for 2019. I mean, they're betting you'll take that shitty cheap EV, even with the state-owned spyware and 17 million government subsidies and this very, very loose interpretation of crash testing.
But to be honest, it's not even consumers that are particularly guilty of this. I mean, governments do it too. Do you remember when Europe was going to build 5G rollout on the basis of Huawei hardware because it was a bit cheaper? Or we had a case a couple of years ago where UK local authorities were buying their surveillance cameras from a Chinese manufacturer, and the government, because they were cheap and central government thought this was fine before having a panic. Or Hungary taking Chinese money, constantly. And in fact, you now actually have, at times, you have Chinese police officers patrolling the streets of Budapest as part of some strange economic and security cooperation agreement. So yeah, I mean the consumers are taking their cue from somewhere here. But I think this, as you mentioned, gets to a slightly uncomfortable truth, which is that the EV war never was about cars. It was about who gets to define what progress looks like, who's willing to burn the most cash, etc., etc. The US wants freedom and Tesla stock. Europe wants regulations and artisanal supply chains. China doesn't really give a fuck about any of that and wants to sell you 4 color options and zero margins. Like, the West can build EVs, but can it develop a response that isn't 10 years late, twice the price, and vibes and climate guilt powered?
This is so depressing. So depressing. But Alex, why are we talking about this now? Okay, it's because the global car market and that supposedly boring, stable 20th century industry that your dad used to follow in Top Gear and we at this stage might make a version podcast of, has quietly become this battlefield for geopolitical supremacy. EVs are no longer just about getting from A to B in a little washing machine type vehicle. They're actually about data control and resource leverage, trade weaponization, and statecraft, all wrapped up in this kind of plastic and politely parked machine in your driveway.
Yeah, and while China floods the market, the West is still arguing over who should build the chargers. Governments are subsidizing Teslas in rich suburbs, while European car makers who haven't innovated in, basically anything in about 20 years are playing defense against cars that are much cheaper and work. And yeah, enthusiasts for the rules-based global trade system like me, it's not been a great few years.
Well, we're going to leave it on that super optimistic view. Thanks for listening to But This Time It's Different. If you enjoyed this podcast, because we now have the subscribe button, feel free to use that. And send us your favorite dystopian EV ad campaigns. Or if you end up going to a city in China that is totally empty, let us know.
Yeah, and we'll be back unless we've been priced out of our own industry by a seagull. And I don't mean the Chinese EV, because Sinead and I have the dashboard. Based on the number of people who will be watching this, a live stream of a seagull would probably beat it. See you next time.
See you next time.